I beg to move the motion in my name and the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Mr Speaker, right at the heart of the local government funding settlement, there lurks a rather nasty little surprise. What the Chancellor and the Secretary of State trumpeted as an increase in funding for councils was nothing of the sort, because what we got instead of the promised end to austerity was a Conservative council tax bombshell. The government made a choice to clobber hard-pressed families with a 5% council tax rise after the government's mistakes led our country into the worst recession of any major economy. Now, there are two big problems with this. It's economically illiterate to push up taxes while the economy is in crisis, and it's dishonest to trumpet the end of austerity when most councils will still be forced to cut services even after they impose the Conservative tax hike, because the rising costs of social care outstrip any increase in revenue, and they've done nothing about that crisis.
Yes. Could you please explain, if you do not think councils should be increasing taxes, why the Mayor of London is proposing to increase his precept by 10%?
It was actually the Secretary of State for Transport that told the Mayor of London that he had to increase council tax. Oh, yes, it was. And the reason why there is a funding gap in London is because Londoners have done the right thing and followed the government advice to keep COVID safe by keeping off public transport as much as they can do, and so the revenues coming into Transport for London have collapsed, but the government refused to provide the financial support to cover that problem. I imagine the government thought they were punishing the Mayor of London ahead of the London mayoral elections. What they've actually done is punish Londoners, and that was wrong. Now, when we're looking at council tax, the government's message to council taxpayers is this: pay more but get less under the Conservatives. Last March, as the country went into lockdown, the Secretary of State made a commitment to fund councils to do what's necessary to get communities through the crisis. He was right to say that. I give him credit for saying that. But just 2 months later, he broke that promise. The Conservative-led Local Government Association estimates that councils are facing a £2.5 billion funding gap as a result of the lost income and additional costs of supporting communities over the past year through these unprecedented circumstances. The government's planned council tax increase will raise just under £2 billion next year. If the government hadn't broken their promise on funding, councils would already have that amount of funding available to them. And of course, the government threw away £10 billion on crony contracts to companies with links to senior Conservative politicians. Just a proportion of that money would have plugged councils' funding gap entirely. The government's failure over the past year has left Britain with the worst recession of any major economy and one of the highest death rates in the world. Now, with their inflation-busting tax hikes, the government is making hard-working families pay the price for Conservative failure. And the timing really couldn't be worse. The Tory tax hike will land on people's doormats in the same month that over 2 million people come off the furlough scheme. Many of those people are worried sick about their future job security. Millions more are worried about their income falling. This is no time to clobber them with a tax hike.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. He mentions recessions and not good timing for increasing council tax. When he was leader of Lambeth Council during 2007-2008, he increased council tax during that economic recession. Why did he think it was OK then?
I'm glad the honourable gentleman raises that, because I won control of Lambeth Council for the Labour Party in 2006, taking over from an administration jointly run by the Conservatives that had raised council tax by 33% over 4 years. 33% over 4 years, and yet service performance was on the floor. I froze council tax with no increase at all for 2 years, and yet despite doing that, we raised the performance of standards that were left on the floor by Conservatives to achieve in children's services an outstanding rating in every single category of services. We did that because members on this side understand value for money, members on the benches opposite simply do not. And the proof of that is in what you're trying to do with the council tax rise this year. Families that are worried about paying their heating bills or putting food on the table simply can't afford it. It will put them under even greater financial strain, and it will hit high streets that right now are struggling to survive. Many local businesses are on their last legs financially after years of restrictions. These tax rises threaten to choke off spending just as we need the economy to start opening up and motoring after the pandemic. With the government now in full retreat on the devolution agenda, there's still one thing they're very interested in devolving, and that's the blame for cuts and council tax hikes made in Downing Street. The Secretary of State tried to justify the tax hike by claiming he's giving councils a choice. I'm sure he's going to repeat that at the dispatch box today. But the truth is, he isn't. The government's funding plans, published in December, include the expectation, the assumption that council tax will go up. Not an option, an expectation. Council's biggest long-term financial headache is how to pay for social care. As more people, thankfully, live longer, councils need more funding to offer frail older people the care they need to make the most of their lives. But the government has cut funding over the past decade, forcing councils to restrict care so it's only available to those in the most severe categories of need. On his very first day in office, standing on the steps of number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister told the country he had a plan to fix the social care crisis. No one's seen a dot or a comma of that plan ever since. So councils have been forced to keep cutting because the Prime Minister's plan doesn't seem to exist, unless the Secretary of State can tell us differently when he speaks at the dispatch box later on. And let's not forget that because a council tax increase raises less money in poorer areas, the government is deepening the postcode lottery for social care instead of ensuring that every single older and disabled person anywhere in our country gets the care they need regardless of where they live. This government is not levelling the country up, they're pulling the country apart.
For giving way, can I just clarify? If we don't raise this money in council tax, it's still got to come from somewhere. How would he pay for it?
Well, the Secretary of State's already given him the answer to that, and I'm very pleased to repeat what the Secretary of State and the Chancellor said last March. They would fully compensate councils for the cost of getting the country through the crisis. £2.5 billion funding gap is what they've still got left, according to James Jamieson, the Conservative leader of the Local Government Association. That is more than the amount that would be raised in council tax, so he can do the maths as well as I can. It wouldn't be necessary if the Secretary of State kept his promises. Now, the costs of social care this year will rise faster than any additional income that's being made available to pay for it. So the only choice the government is giving all of our town halls is to put up council tax while families are still suffering from the effects of the recession, or to cut social care during an unprecedented global health pandemic. That's no choice at all, and it's why the government has got this so badly wrong. Older people have suffered enough thanks to this government's failures. Over a third of all COVID deaths in the UK have been in care homes because the government was too slow on distributing PPE, too slow on rolling out testing, and too slow to act on hospital discharges that seeded the disease in those very care homes. Councils need funding to pay for the care older people deserve, and not just during this pandemic. Hard-working families need support to cope with the hit their incomes have suffered over the past year, and struggling high street businesses need the government to encourage spending, not choke it off. Councils of all political colours will be forced to put up council tax this year, not because they want to, but because the government's left councils with no real choice. The costs of COVID will have to be paid for, but not by raising taxes on people who can't afford it at a time when their incomes are under so much strain and the pandemic is still raging. Make no mistake, this is a Conservative tax hike made in Downing Street and imposed on hard-working families after the government's mistakes left our country facing the deepest recession of any major economy. We won't secure our economy by choking off spending. We won't protect the NHS by denying older people the care they need. And we won't rebuild our country by killing off our high streets. I urge the government, even at this late stage, to think again and scrap their plans to force town halls to increase council tax at a time like this.
The question is, as on the order paper, I now call Secretary of State Robert Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move an amendment in the name of the Prime Minister and I. Mr. Speaker, the party opposite's position on this most important question is so inconsistent and contradictory that it's difficult to know where to start. But let me give a few basic facts to the House. The Leader of the Opposition thinks councils shouldn't be given limited flexibility to decide themselves locally to raise their council tax rate. Yet, as we've already heard from my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, the Labour Mayor of London has decided to hike his share of council tax by 10%, while still finding the room to up his personal PR budget to £13 million, run by a £130,000 a year spin doctor based in California. Now, I'm all in favour of working from home, but that really is quite a leap. I will.
Could we just leave London for a moment? Because there's a real dissonance in what you pay in a big city like London and what you pay and get back in a rural area like Westminster, which my right honourable friend is very familiar with. We pay a lot more, we pay slightly more, and we get a lot less, sometimes just not even a street lamp, maybe even a rubbish collection every 2 weeks. So can the Secretary of State address this real issue on behalf of rural people and say what he's doing to help us in rural areas?
I certainly can, and he is fortunate to have a good Conservative council, and they will benefit from the largest ever rural services grant in the settlement, which will give more money to help deliver the sorts of services that his constituents will rely on in a very rural part of the country. Now, the Shadow Housing Secretary himself the Shadow Community Secretary, as leader of Lambeth Council, hiked council tax by over £100, including a 5% rise at the height of the unemployment crisis, was being presided over by the last Labour government. Yet today, he believes that councils shouldn't even have limited flexibility to do the same. Now, Labour leaders in local government don't want limited flexibility to increase council taxes. They want to abolish the right of local people to veto excessive tax increases altogether, so that they can increase taxes by as much as they want. And of course, we all know where that leads for Labour councils. Whilst council tax has fallen under the Conservatives in real terms since 2010, the last Labour government presided over a doubling of council tax, and in Labour-run Wales, it is trebling. Perhaps the Leader of the Opposition should pick up the phone and check in with his own local leadership from time to time and get their ducks in a row before opposing the very same flexibility that their councils are the greatest advocates of, from Leeds to Telford to the Wirral to Sefton. The A to Z of Labour local councils have demanded that we allow them to increase council tax, I quote, without limit. They describe in their responses to the local government settlement, I will in a moment, they describe in their responses that keeping their tax-raising instincts in check is frustrating, an imposition, not an imposition on taxpayers, I would hasten to add, but they barely get a look in. And it's all there in black and white in the Labour Council's responses to the local government settlement? I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Grateful to him for giving way. I mean, he may want to correct the record because actually I froze council tax with zero increase at all the year following the crisis in 2007-8 and the year after that as well. But does he recognise that actually it's the Conservative leader of the Local Government Association, James Jamieson, a councillor I'm sure he knows very well, who has called for the cap to be lifted from council tax increases and the referendum abolished, not the Labour Party front bench?
Just, you did move the amendment. I presume you don't wish to. Could you withdraw the moving of the amendment?
Yes, I'm happy to withdraw, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll come on to the remarks of the LGA in a few minutes, if I may. But he can't have it both ways. He can't say that he's unhappy that we have imposed a cap which provides limited flexibility for local councils to decide of their own volition whether to increase council tax or not, or that in fact he wants the cap lifted altogether and councils can increase it without limit, which seems to be the consensus amongst his own local government leaders. And perhaps the honourable gentleman could check in with his own council in Croydon, a council that in their consultation response to the department on last year's finance settlement said, and I quote, "We are disappointed that the ability to increase locally determined council tax has been reduced and that it could only be increased by 2%, directly contradicting the honourable gentleman." And how are these councils actually performing? Well, Croydon is a council that has found itself in £1.5 billion of debt, the only council to go bust in 2020 following the collapse of its house-building company Brick by Brick, which may not have proved very good at building, but it did prove extremely good at owing people a lot of money. The problem is that Labour in local government today is a catalogue of failure, of dysfunction and of waste. In Nottingham, the party opposite blew £38 million on a failed energy company, made 230 of its employees redundant over Skype before rewarding themselves with a backdated pay rise. Robin Hood Energy, as they describe it. Well, Robin Hood stole from the rich, but Labour's Robin Hood just stole from everyone. Up in Durham, the council at the height of the pandemic approved a new 3,500 square foot roof terrace on their £50 million county hall. Merton Council reportedly set up a building company with a £2 million investment, only not to deliver a single home. The council leader said it was designed to make money, but he had built in, I kid you not, jumping off points. Well, it turns out that there wasn't a parachute for local residents. Labour Warrington has debts of at least £1.6 billion, and after Bristol City Council's socialist energy company went bust, Warrington's own version, Together Energy, somehow decided it would be a good idea to buy it, and then, of course, got into financial difficulties itself. Hackney Council planted thousands of trees only for them to die due to neglect. Literally, Labour dead wood. Even the Labour local government front bench keeps up this tradition, inexplicably taking two shadow secretaries of state to do the job of one actual one. Now, the shadow housing secretary freely admits to reporters that she has no policies. The shadow local government secretary reportedly rebuked a colleague in the shadow cabinet for trying to develop some. From what we've heard today, perhaps it would have been better if he'd taken his own advice. His first attempt, after 9 months, has fallen apart at the slightest interrogation. Labour councils themselves want to raise taxes locally, at or above the flexibility that we are proposing. Labour and Lib Dem councils consistently have higher council taxes than Conservative councils. And Labour councils consistently underperform Conservative councils. Whether it is Croydon or Nottingham, they are consistently letting down their local residents. I'll give way.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Can I just add to his list there? Because in Birmingham, what we've seen is the City Council moving a bus depot originally budgeted £2 million, which has escalated to £16 million, which local people are going to have to pay, all to achieve it moving down the road by only 300 metres. Isn't this just a perfect example of Labour incompetence in local government?
Well, there are many examples I could cite from Birmingham City Council, but I don't think time allows me to do that. But let's contrast, if I may, this government's approach to protecting the interests of local taxpayers with that of Labour. In 1 year alone, the last Labour administration oversaw an increase of council tax by a staggering 12.9%. In comparison, this government, since 2010, as we've said, has implemented 5 years of council tax freezes, under which the great majority of councils didn't increase council tax at all. In RPI terms, council tax is lower than it was in 2010. And we've introduced the legislation to end crude and universal top-down capping, ensuring significant council tax increases can only be implemented through a referendum, giving local taxpayers a right to veto excessive tax increases. And across the country, Conservatives charge the lowest taxes. You see this on the ground wherever you look. In the Leader of the Opposition's constituency, in Labour-run Camden, council tax is 3 times as high as neighbouring Conservative-run Westminster. As I'm sure the honourable gentleman can testify, residents in Labour Merton and Lambeth pay almost twice the council tax of residents just living 1 or 2 roads away in Wandsworth. The Mayor of London has presided over a rise in council tax every year he was elected, when the Prime Minister, as Mayor, to put this into perspective, has reduced the amount of council tax he charged Londoners by almost 11% during his tenure. In his last year alone, Bandy households in the 32 London boroughs saw their GLA council tax charges fall by 6.4%. And across the country, Conservative mayors, whether Andy Street in the West Midlands or Ben Houchin in Teesside, are continuing that tradition. Low on taxes, high on leadership and delivery. Now, the Provisional Local Finance Settlement, which I announced to the House on the 17th of December, set out our proposals to increase the core spending power available to councils by 4.5%, a significant and real terms increase. This coming on top of a 4.5% real terms increase this year, a settlement the Labour Party considered so good that they didn't even oppose it, for the first time in living memory. In total, we expect core spending power for English councils to increase from £49 billion this year to £51.2 billion next year, in line with last year's increases, and recognising the resources councils do need to meet the extraordinary pressures whilst maintaining the essential services they provide. The measures I proposed will provide an additional £1 billion of funding for adult and children's social care. We've also confirmed we intend to roll forward last year's £1.4 billion of social care grant and continue the 2020-21 improved better care funding at £2.1 billion. We are considering responses to the settlement consultation and will return to the House, Mr. Speaker, to set out the final funding package for local government in the very near future. Yet the Shadow Secretary of State has suggested to the House today that this government has not delivered on our commitment to communities during the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, this past year has seen the largest ever injection of in-year cash to the local government sector. Taken together, we provide over £36 billion of support to and through local government in response to the pandemic. To put this in context, in 2019-20, the entire council tax take for the whole of England was £31.6 billion, less than we provided in year to and through local councils this year alone. Local authorities have received £8 billion in direct funding, with a further £3 billion extra already announced for 2021-22, and we forecast to add an additional £1.2 billion to that from schemes to compensate for lost council income from sales, fees and charges. This takes the total additional funding provided to local authorities to over £12 billion, £2 billion more than the sum the LGA called for at the start of the pandemic, the sum estimated to be the cost to councils of COVID by the Shadow Secretary of State himself at the time. And we know today, We know today, Mr. Speaker, that we have provided £1 billion more than local government has itself self-reported to my department as COVID-related costs throughout that period. £1 billion more than even councils have told us they have spent and need. So let's be clear that when the Prime Minister, when the Chancellor and I promised to support local councils and the communities that relied on it, we meant that promise and we have delivered on that promise. Since the start of the pandemic, we've mobilised our welfare system like never before, with generous income support schemes, mortgage holiday support for renters, a £500 million local authority hardship fund, a £170 million COVID winter grant scheme, and much needed help with utilities. And to support local economies, we've provided £12 billion in grants to thousands of businesses the length and breadth of the country, a business rates holiday worth around £10 billion to local retail, hospitality and leisure sectors, and operated a major reimbursement scheme for lost council income, recovering billions of pounds from car parks and leisure centres and theatres and tourist attractions, money that will go to help councils to move forward and to recover. And that's not even to mention £4.6 billion of unring-fenced grant support to councils, £1 billion through the Infection Control Fund, £1 billion through the Contain Outbreak Management Grant, £300 million via the Test and Trace Service Support Grant. I could go on and on and on. 5 million food boxes delivered, 2 million shielded, protected through councils, and of course 33,000 rough sleepers brought in off the streets under the world-class Everyone In programme and given the chance to rebuild their lives. That, Mr. Speaker, is central and local government working together through a unique pandemic to support millions of people across this country. Mr. Speaker, local government has been and remains at the forefront of our response to COVID-19, and this government is proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in their hour of greatest need, with the officers, the teachers, the refuse collectors, the care workers, the environmental health officers enforcing our regulations. For all that they have done, we salute them and we thank them on behalf of our communities and our country. And we owe them this, the stability, the certainty and the flexibility to plan for a brighter future ahead. And that, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what we have done, what we will do and what we will always do for them. Our communities have never needed good council leadership more than they do today. And Mr. Speaker, whether it is in Croydon or in Nottingham, across the country the reputation of too many Labour councils is, frankly, rotten. We take no lectures from the party opposite who provide over eye-watering increases in council tax throughout their time in office and whose economic mismanagement in local government has been laid painfully bare for all to see. The reports, Mr. Speaker, of those councils, Croydon and Nottingham, they spell it out. Mismanagement, waste, poor public services and, yes, higher council taxes, to a toxic legacy of debt and dysfunction, not just for today, but for future generations as well. And where, frankly, was the Shadow Secretary of State? Where was his denunciation of Croydon and of Nottingham? He was silent, he was invisible, his famous Twitter account as uncharacteristically quiet as that of Donald Trump. No leadership when the country needed it. Well, we have reduced council tax in real terms under our watch. They have increased it time and time again. Well, we have been clear that we have a plan to protect local councils and that we care about local council tax payers. They have perfected the art of saying nothing at all. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, council taxpayers across the country deserve better than this absurd and hypocritical debate from the Labour Party, and they will have the opportunity to say so in May. Yeah.